need.
Let me ask you a question real quick before you record it.
Okay. Uh-oh. Pause. Yeah.
This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, friends. My name is Pat McFarland, and I'm one of the co-hosts for this event. We also have a new friend who's helping me. Rhonda Stoll is also a co-host of the Lunch and Learn. And today we will open up with announcements, brief announcements. And then Rhonda, you can see, has her screen share and she's ready to go. So I will start by telling you about Rhonda. No, wait, pause. Let me open it up right away for announcements.
I just want to say hi to Rhonda. See me, it's Barbara. Okay.
Are there any other announcements? Okay, then once again, we will open up after our discussion with Rhonda, we will open up again for any announcements people have. So it is my great pleasure to introduce a friend, and that is Rhonda Hill. I'm going to tell you a little bit of the descriptions of her. Rhonda is one of the bravest people I know. And what she does so well is to connect, create, and increase capacity for change. And that ties in with the mission of the League of Women Voters because we are trying to empower voters and defend democracy. So we definitely need people who are willing to walk their talk. And Rhonda is willing to start conversations that are sometimes difficult for friends. Her background is that she created something called Not Your Mama's Tea. And I admit, Rhonda, I have yet to participate in that. She's well known for her work called raceandfaith.org, where she is helping all kinds of groups, faith groups, corporate groups, social justice groups, create an anti-racist culture. Some of the words that are used to describe her work is that she's spot on, that she is very comfortable with participatory work, that people can unpack racism depending on what is their various point of entry. Her goal is racial equality, and she uses case studies to help us engage in our own personal reflection, which pays close attention to the cultural details and inspires us to take action. I met Rhonda as she was working with the Amazing Faith Dinners with the Interfaith Conference of Greater Milwaukee. Her background is Master of Arts in Pastoral Studies with a Master of Art degree in Pastoral Studies and Counseling. From Edgewood, she focused on marriage and family therapy, and she's a proud graduate of Rufus King High School. So we have been lucky to have her in Milwaukee for a while. As a gifted speaker, she is able to motivate, to help us change, and to inspire hope. And so at this point, I'm going to let her introduce herself in ways that I have missed. So Rhonda, I'm very grateful and we welcome you.
Thank you so much. That was a very generous introduction. I don't need to elaborate on that. I feel very much so represented by what you just shared and highly flattered. So thank you very much. I'm excited to present to you this afternoon, and I hope I'm within the 20 minutes. I'm assuming it might be a little grace there. So if everybody can see my screen, I'm gonna start the presentation, I think, or not. Uh-oh, maybe I just did something wrong. Sorry, this is my first time using this format. So give me one. There we go. Okay. Now everybody can see my screen well and all that, right? So
Yes.
Today we're going to talk about addressing racism and the generational divide. Um, I've been passionate about the ways we look at racism and talk about it together across generations. And so this has been one of my talking points for a while. And quickly, I'm glad you all came. I'm glad you decided to spend your lunch this way. I don't mind if you're eating or sipping drinks over this time, as long as you aren't crunching and smacking all through the presentation, okay? You can reach me at my email, Rhonda@raceandfaith.org. Find me on our website, www.raceandfaith.org. So thank you for engaging me in this conversation today.
And Rhonda, may I interrupt just momentarily? Are
Yeah,
you willing to receive donations at that website?
I sure am. I'll be back to that. I'm always willing to take donations. um, So, race and faith, we recognize that there are many entry points into the conversations about racism. Part of our process is to invite people to bring all of who they are into the conversation about race. The part about race and faith, when people see that, I think people get a little nervous because they think like, oh Lord, we're going to talk about racism and I got to talk about my faith. I think that might be a little misleading for people. It is our acknowledgement that racism is not just an intellectual exercise. We put a lot of our energy, I think, into this conversation of just saying, like, let me see how many books I can read, or how many classes I can go to. And if I consume all this information, then I'm going to stop being racist. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't think people are necessarily racist because of a lack of information. I think people have issues of the heart, and some beliefs that support them in having racist actions and attitudes. And so this is our goal, is to say, let's bring all of who you are, beliefs included, those things that inform how you see the world, bring that in and let's investigate that. And so I have these two visuals up, usually with our learning. When we think about learning, people learn 4 different ways: either visual, auditory, read it and write it, or kinesthetically. And so we take that approach with race and faith as well, as saying, in these 4 areas, we have our heart, our mind, our soul, and our spirit. And a lot of times we come to information through one of those entry points. Either you are a person who is very focused on the intellect and you want to consume and learn a lot of things, read a lot of things, or you ask a lot of questions. You may be a person who comes at things from the heart space, very emotional. You engage things only through that. Some people come through that spirit or soul space where they investigate, well, what does my morals tell me about this? They filter that information through a lens of morals, or and maybe even like that intuition space. And then there's that body piece, which we label that two ways. It is the ways you allow yourself to actually get engaged. I have a friend, as soon as something happens, I know the first thing that he's going to do, he's going to be out there picketing. His thing is to totally engage right off the bat. Yeah, Pat, I think that's probably you too. Right off the bat, that's his entry point into it. It's like, let me move and do something with my body. Or you can also say, like, how am I processing or feeling this conversation take place in my body? And so as we move through this conversation, I may not have that much time today, but we like to take time and do what we call a quadrant temperature check, looking at those 4 quadrants: your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength, and assessing what is speaking to you right now, what's most alive for you right now, so you would know what your normal point of entry is into the conversation. We would ask you, yes, engage that one, but then stretch yourself. If you're a person who you are immediately engaged right at the heart space, we'd ask you just to pay a little more attention to, like, okay, well, what's going on right now with you in your mind? What thoughts may you have? How do you need to engage that? If you're a person who want to just quick take action, we may say, okay, glad you want to get to work, but why don't you slow down for a second and just process your own emotions before you get started at the action space. Does that make sense for everybody? I'm usually on Zoom, I'm used to those reaction buttons and I can get feedback that way. But if you're tracking me, just drop a line in the chat box by letting me know what is your entry point. How do you usually come to these situations about racism? Are you a person that's just all heart emotion? You really deeply process things that way? Are you maybe you get overly worried or sensitive about some of these things? Or maybe you might be like me. Some days these days I feel sometimes kind of numb with some things that been going on. Is your soul really stirred by these conversations? Are you facing a lot of religious convictions? Do you come and filter through the conversation there and saying, what does my spiritual text tell me about these things? Or what is my own morals? How are they guiding me? What about the mind space? Are you coming through this with a lot of questions? A lot of philosophies, or are you action oriented? So how do you come to this conversation? Think I can, okay, goody, I can read some of the chat. Some people says depends on the day, soul, heart, mind. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's just something to pay attention to. If we were doing a longer class period, I would be able to kind of spend more time and invite you to engage more that way, but we won't have that much time today. But I just wanted to give this to you and offer this to you as one way that when we're doing our work as Race and Faith, this is how we tend to do our work and try to create and make space for people to really engage and be fully present with all of who they are into this conversation. So just want to remind you as we progress, not so much giving you a lot of rules because we're not engaging in a full class, but I want to just remind you to be respectful, to listen. Most importantly, as you hear certain things mentioned, just to deeply ponder those things. Be sure to ask questions. You can place them in the chat box. That I don't mind. We'll get back to those again, or comments. And then I think when we come to this conversation about racism, we have to be brave. We have to summon all of our courage to be brave. And part of being brave is to being honest and being vulnerable. So I'm reminding you to do that today as you're listening, as you're pondering, as you're respectfully engaging today. Be brave and fully show up, fully bring all of who you are to this conversation today. Growing up and being part of family, being the oldest of 5 children, I've gotten a lot of things from my parents along the way and grandparents. I currently live with my grandmother now. And so there's a lot of things that I have learned from the older generations, and I bet you have too. So I'm curious as to what are some of those things you have inherited along the way. Any favorite recipes this time of year? A lot of people are making cookies or making that favorite holiday dish that grandma gave. What are some of those things that you have from your family that's been passed down? You can put those in the chat box, and if a couple people want to come off mute and just share quickly something that they have gained from the family along the way, that would be appreciated. And I'll check the chat box as well. But what's something you inherited, or some lessons you've learned from your family that you've kept?
This is Peg Schrader. Hard work is valuable.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Peg.
This is Pat McFarland. I learned that after my dad died and left mom, who was 39, with 5 kids under 10, that the only way we would survive is if we stayed a team. And so my family has always promoted getting along with people and taking action together.
Okay. One more.
My faith.
Okay.
Definitely inherited my faith.
Your
From
faith. So with that same thought in mind, what did your family pass down to you about racism? If you would take a moment, ponder and think about that. just as they've passed us down recipes, slogans and phrases, ideas, trust funds. Somebody maybe got lucky and got a healthy trust fund. They did also pass us down some ideas about racism. And a lot of people will say, we didn't talk about race growing up. And I would submit that then that was something they taught you about racism as well, that maybe it's something not to be talked about. So what did you learn from your family? What do you think your family passed down to you about racism? And I would ask you to either put that in the chat box.
For me, this is Rhonda. Hi,
Yes.
Rhonda.
Hi, Rhonda.
For me, that is just, it's normal.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of everyday life, just like I'm breathing.
Right.
For my family is my dad was a bit of a racist, but my mother not as much. I mean, she she never taught us to use derogatory terms and to respect people. And she worked in a mixed environment, and but she wasn't, a radical or anything. But I think what affected me more than family was at the time what was going on, like the civil rights movement, watching. I was always learning, and it was the TV. Then they started to have integrated shows. They had Julia, to see people, to look at, oh, they're, where you brought up with the stereotype and some of my relatives. But then when I saw, no, they're not like that, or people aren't different. We're all the same. We have loves, we have, fears. And that affected my life growing up in the 60s.
I'm Chris's sister, so I grew up in the same family,
Yeah.
but I'm older than she is. I'm 7 to 8 years older, and it was interesting because I agree, absolutely with Chris about our parents, but my mom wanted to keep us separate. I think
Yeah.
the race is separate.
Yeah.
But then I saw her, just as Chris and I were learning through TV and so on, I saw my mom transforming also. And just changing, I think, questioning her ideas about race. Wouldn't you agree, Chris?
Yeah, she did. As when our father passed away, I was 14, and Janet, you were just 18 or 19?
I was 20.
20, okay. And when my dad passed away, I mean, she was the matriarchal society. My dad couldn't make decisions, and it was my mom who always kept our 6 kids together. I mean, he'd get paid and hand his paycheck over to her. So she learned more. And when she had to go out in the world, I think that affected her. She worked in, like I said, in a mixed environment, and she met women and talked. And she was invited to a shower, a baby shower, I think, for a woman. I don't know if you remember this. After my dad died, she worked in this company. It was sort of temporary, where they were transferring records. Anyway, she was invited, and she took the bus, and she was the only white woman there. So she was a little shocked. She thought more of the women that were invited from where she worked would go, but she went. And she said, everything was friendly, everything worked out well. And she was then in her 60s, and this is like 1969, 70 when she went to this. And she just said, well, she was a friend, and we worked side by side, and it was her shower, and of course I was going to go. She never thought of being afraid. So I think some of that rubbed off on us. Like I said, she wasn't a radical. She wasn't going to go to march and things like that. But she always, if she got to know someone, she didn't see color, she saw the person.
Yeah.
And that's what I think my mother gave to Janet and I.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, that's important. And I would encourage you, I'm going to keep moving forward, but if you think of other things you may have learned or didn't learn or wanted to learn, please just place those things in the chat box. Or if you're formulating questions, write those down to bring up to us all later. Okay, I keep. There we go. So from generation to generation, I feel like that it's very important that we restore our collective memory. So along with having these conversations about having intergenerational conversations about racism, I've been doing a lot of talking about myths and myth making and how those myths have distorted our collective memory. And so what I mean by that, myths are stories, right? They're stories that we tell. um, they normally don't have much truth to them. That's why they're myth. And that part of myth making is these continuous stories that I see that we tell when it comes to racism. It's a lot of myth making around whiteness and white supremacy and what it means to be white and how that's been normalized, and everything else outside of whiteness is seen to be abnormal or othered. And I think due to that that mythology, that myth making, that has in fact distorted our collective memory and how we review and see the past. A lot of the things that we learn and what's been more evident through schooling these days. And even if you look at what's been going on in our country over the last 4 years, with Donald Trump's rise to power, a lot of that's been due to, I feel, a mass whitewashing of history that so much so distorted our collective memory that the way people remember history is only to a certain slant, right? That it's only really reviewing history from the eyes of the dominant culture, which is in our country, white culture. And so with that, I think it's our responsibility to start to tell our stories and how we've seen and experienced, just like was just shared a few moments ago, our stories, what was seen, what was heard, and taking those stories of our own personal experiences and really looking at what happened historically in our country to begin to create a more honest collective memory. So let's just practice with this idea of myth and myth making for a moment. What are some current myths about Milwaukee County? What are some things that we've been told and, or thought to think about Milwaukee County?
That every okay, so for me, I'm from Ohio.
Okay.
Not a big upgrade, I know.
It's okay.
Cleveland, mistake on the lake, they used to say. And so for me, I came here, well, I've been here a long time, but they say 53206. They made 2 movies about it. The worst zip code for incarceration in the United States, right? So I'm looking around and I'm like, okay, I understand. But then I realized that, okay, but you have a lot of greatness that have come out of that zip code.
Mhm.
You know, Congresswoman Moore, she came out of North Division. David Crowley came out of North Division. I look around those zip codes. The people who live there are community leaders, Michelle Pitts and different people like that. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
WB is there. So
So
there's a
let
lot
me
of
ask you this question. With that, there's the other part too of that is Miss Rhonda, is with that, with those myths. You heard these stories before you got here, and you got to survey and start saying like, I'm seeing something different. The other part is that then how is that the myth, those stories that you were told about 53206, how does that uphold white supremacy?
it feeds it. I saw some people in the chat say that they were told, let me see, that black people were bad, um, black and brown people were bad in a number of ways, be afraid. Um, I read that, letter from my dad in WW2 that he was racist. Obviously he supported me, I think, I'm sorry, and over time, but obviously at one point at one place he was racist, he may have had some racist views, but then he evolved. So just like I was afraid of that zip code, and then I evolved. So it
Mm.
kind of, you know what I'm saying? I mean,
So that that first myth, those stories you were hearing that incited fear, and I'm gonna take that and summarize a little bit, saying that those fear and those stories about people in the 53206 zip code, you're saying hearing those things reinforced white supremacy, and they reinforced white supremacy, one, by possibly making you afraid, which I think fear is a good way. It's that continuous othering that happens, and that continuous centering of whiteness and white expectations as the norm, right?
yes,
And if you could continue to make a certain group of people look bad or seem like it's nothing good from that area, then that leaves us to say, well, what is good? So then if I were to say, what are some myths you heard about Whitefish Bay? Would there be someone else that would have a scary story about Whitefish Bay? I mean, as a person of color, I could say, yes, I've heard things about Whitefish Bay, but it's to how they have marginalized Black and brown people. But on a large scale, you wouldn't think that Whitefish Bay would incite fear in the same way that 53206 would in people. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So as we think about myths and why we tell certain stories, is to think about, well, how is this story keeping white supremacy in place? What is the purpose? What purpose is it serving? And really, I'm saying the purpose is to serve white supremacy and that narrative that has tended to shape our whole political landscape in this country, which has, I feel, fed into the Trump presidency, right? This idea of the myth of let's make America great again. It all feeds this certain narrative. So what's another myth we've heard about Milwaukee?
That it has a poor school system. That no one who graduates from a Milwaukee school, high school or whatever, is equal to that of the suburbs or the other areas in Wisconsin.
Okay, now I'm reading the name up there. It says James Brown. I don't know if that's necessarily your name. I could be wrong. You don't sound like a James Brown, but
I'm using my husband's computer.
Oh, okay. What's your name?
Christine Brown.
Okay, Miss Christine. How does that myth serve white supremacy? The NPS schools are bad and they don't stack up to other school systems.
Well, a lot people say, well, Black people can't learn. They're not as intelligent as white people.
You just did two things there. Now NPS means Black.
Right.
So then that's a whole nother thing in play, right? So now NPS is code word. It's now a code word for Black. So I think that's interesting. I'm just pointing that out. I think that's interesting. That's a whole nother story in itself. But yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I mean, that's just the myth.
Yeah.
Because there's I think, what is it? Is it 50? It's like 60 or 70 white and 30%. I don't know the percentage, but people are brought up to think, oh, well, I mean, I was always told that. And I knew it was a misnomer because I knew I met a lot of people graduated from MPS, white and Black, and they were very intelligent people. So it feeds into that, when you hear people say that, and that's the tragedy. And yes, there's problems, but there's problems in all school systems,
right.
Especially with budget cuts and not respecting teachers as much as they should, I mean, it's just, but I just feel that's one of the major ones. I don't want to keep talking. I'll shut up.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So that's showing us that sometimes it's part of we're even with the 53206 example of this school example, we're getting parts of the story. We're not getting the whole story, getting one view, and that one view again is where we get to that distortion, what I'm calling like distorting our collective memory or how we look back and tell a story. And so if we were to rightly begin to correct these stories, I think Rhonda started to do it in her story, was saying like, hey, from 53206, there came Gwen Moore, there came, I think you mentioned the Pitts family, there came X, Y, Z, just mention all these other people that say, wait a minute, it's some good things that could be found here. Or to your point, I'm a product of MPS. I graduated from Rufus King High School in 1998. I have 2 master's degrees. So it's possible that you can go to MPS, be a Black person, and do okay. So I think it's how we begin to start really, rightly telling those stories to weave together, again, a more collective memory, something that is more true and more honest, that when we look back, we can say, yes, MPS have had some problems, but despite some of the problems due to racism, they've been able to produce students who've gone on to do very well, just as good as students in any other school district. Does that make sense? Are you tracking what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Give me like a thumbs up or something. That's the only way I can get some real exchange because we're not live and in class, so I can't read your faces, and I don't see reaction buttons on here. So if you want to give me, thank you, Pat, I'll take yours. Or just in the chat box, let me know you're tracking what I'm saying. So this is making how we tell our stories even more important, right? How we share from generation to generation what is actually happening in our own families, in our own communities, in our own school systems, how we have experienced it, and matching that up against the other information that is available to us in our communities, in our churches, through our histories. We become part of that the living story that we all can tell together to, I'm assuming, help us again be able to look back and piece together some of those things that may have been left out on purpose. So I'm encouraging us to really get together and listen deeply to one another, share our stories, and do it over and over and over again. And I know that with even some of that, it can be difficult. My grandmother, like I said, I live with her, and I've gone to her and I've asked her a couple times, Granny, tell me about what was life like for you growing up. And she has met me time and time again with, girl, don't nobody want to talk about that stuff. And I have to take that and remember, like, it has been painful for her. It has been some painful stories in our family. It's been some painful history. And when I get stories from her, it's as she wants to tell them, actually. Like, just sometimes she'll just say certain things. And last year I took a trip, and this is what really got me going on, like, how important it is to really engage and have generational conversations. I took a trip to Alabama for the first time, and we went to Birmingham, Selma, Montgomery, and it was a very powerful experience for me. And on my way to that trip, before I went, I asked my grandmother, did we have anybody in our family that was lynched? And she told me, not that she knows of, but where she grew up in the town over, she knew of families that had to leave because they were being lynched. And so when I'm saying we need to just to have these types of conversations about racism, that's the kind of conversation I'm daring us to be brave about, and sit down with each other with and talk about, while we still have our elders, and some of you are the elders, right? So it's to encourage you to have those conversations with your grandchildren, your nieces, your nephews, your cousins, and learning what you can give and what you can learn, how we can receive from each other. I fear that in our country, the ways that we've been going and how we've been getting to the space that we're in now is because we haven't been having these conversations. That what was happening in the 50s, the 60s, with such of the movements against racial injustice, that those things, for generations younger than me, I can say like the 20s, some of the 30s, it's a huge gap and a miss, missing. People are kind of like, it's told like it's a fairy tale. It's told as if it was something that was long, long, long ago, and it was one or two people, Rosa Parks and Dr. King, who did a march, and And that's it. And there's a lot of school systems that still don't even celebrate the King holiday. And so it's for us to really be more intentional about how we have these conversations. And so I just want to invite you to think about, just like with, sometimes you get that tea set or china from your family that maybe you didn't want or don't need, or maybe you had to tweak one of those family recipes that was passed down to get it to your liking. I think that that's sometimes what we have to do too with our family stories around race and what they've taught us over years, some of those myths that we may have heard or learned along the way. And I want us to think about for a second, like, what are some of those things that you did learn about racism that need to just be tossed into the trash, or maybe need to be adjusted? And the adjustment thing would be this example. A lot of people would say, I was taught to be colorblind. Now, colorblind on its face may not seem like a bad thing because it implies that we should love everybody. But what it misses is that I'm not inviting you to see this person for what they bring, each individual person. So don't pretend you can't see me. See me fully and embrace me and accept me. So that's how I would tweak the colorblind. Yes, we want to love everybody and treat everybody as our neighbor, but we need to also see them and what attributes and assets that they actually bring, because they are different, because they don't look just like me. What are some things that you have just thrown away from some things you've learned about your family, from your family about racism, or some things that you have adjusted along the way? Well, if you don't want to mention it out loud, you can put it in the chat box.
Be brave,
Or
my
you don't need
sister.
to process it, that's
Others.
fine too. Go ahead.
One thing that I was taught when I was growing up was that people discriminate because they're fearful. They're fearful of the unknown. And I've since read things that make me realize that discriminatory thinking is promoted by people with self-interest. And it's the that comes before the fear, that creates the fear, those things that are told to us about the Milwaukee. For instance, some of the things you mentioned about Milwaukee, the myths that we've heard. And it's those myths that create the fear. It's not necessarily ignorance that creates a fear. It's not knowing nothing that creates a fear. It's discriminatory thinking that make us fearful. And it was just a little tweak of my understanding.
Thank you. Mary Ellen?
Yes,
right?
yes.
Thank you for sharing. Anyone else? Anything you had to either toss or adjust that you learned from your family?
I learned, I learned that not everybody, that racism was everywhere and that it was normal. And that I still believe that it is in a lot of places. But I'm learning that it doesn't have to be normal.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to accept it. So I love that about my 48-year-old self, that I don't have to accept it. The second thing is to what Miss Mary Ellen was just saying, that I just learned this year. After being on this earth for 48 years and living through this Donald Trump phase, I've learned that people who are racist, especially those who are more poor, because you figure, why would they support someone like him? And everybody has their reasons, okay? Especially if you're poor. I understand if you have money because you invested and he's making you money. A lot of my friends support him because he's making the money. I get that. But if you're poor and you're white, why are you supporting him? And it goes back to what Miss Mary Ellen said. And someone told me, one of my white friends told me, because that's what they have.
Mm,
They don't have money, but they do have their ethnicity.
mm,
And so if you have a person who's saying white is right, white is powerful, why wouldn't I support that if I'm white?
Hmm.
So that made sense to me.
mm-hmm,
48 years for that to make sense to me. Just like Black Lives Matter to someone who's in rural America and they don't have enough food to eat and their jobs are gone and their farms are going under and all they have is their ethnicity, they clung to that.
mm-hmm,
So
mm-hmm,
so that made sense to me,
mm-hmm.
regardless of whatever else. So that was what I learned this year.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. And continue to ponder that, and think through that. Whatever myths you may have learned growing up from your families or communities, what is it that you maybe need to reassess and evaluate and toss out and get rid of? What may need to be just tweaked, because it came from a good place, but it just didn't quite hit the mark in the way that needed to be. And then I want to invite you to think about your role in telling the story, your role in sitting down and engaging family members, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, cousins, godchildren. How do you create space to engage in honest dialogue and cross that generational divide and invite them to ask you questions? I recently had a talk with my niece who's 15 and just went through the same series of things with her, conversations with her, learning what's going on in her world and how she's experiencing racism and seeing it happen. I don't know what happened to my slides, just jumped all over the place. And um, it was my niece, she's a bright girl. I love her. She's taking it all in. So she was really thoughtful. And I asked her some of these questions that I put out to you to ask, which I asked her, has she ever experienced any racism? How is she seeing it expressed? And what does she understand racism to be? And then I also asked her, what did she learn from us? What did we teach her as a family about racism? And what else did she need to ask me? And we talked for about 15 minutes. And I learned a lot from her. And what I really learned is how much she has been absorbing what's happening in our country today. And I've also learned some sad things, which is how racism is still being manifested for children her age. I think we tend to think that because this is a younger generation, that they have it figured out and that they're really addressing racism in positive ways. And I'm learning that they're not. And I think it's because we really have to have conversations. One of the things she was sharing with me is that she's afraid that youth in her generation are performative. They've gotten the language. They're getting the language right. They're talking more, hearing more things about white privilege, racism, white supremacy. She doesn't feel like they're changing much, but they're performing and they can pretend like that they are quote unquote woke or wanting to do the anti-racist thing, but not quite there yet. So I thought that was interesting and something that I think we definitely could engage and look as we dare to get into deeper conversations. Would there be some questions or other ways that you think that you could enter into a conversation with someone in your family about racism, or perhaps you have some apprehension? Would you think that there may be some things that would block you from being able to get into a one-to-one or have a group conversation about racism, and just asking some of these types of questions?
So I'm going to jump in. with a story of a 6-year-old. So some of you have heard the story, so I'll try to do it quickly. I have this little 6-year-old. This is 2 years ago. We're riding in the car, and she goes, "Grandma," and I go, "Yes, Anya." And she says, "You know, Grandma, it's really sad when people are arrested by the cops and they go to their house. It must be so scary." And I go, "Yeah, I'm sure it is, Anya." "Grandma," I go, "Yes, Anya. When are they going to arrest Trump?" And I said, "Tell me more, Anya." And she said, "Well, he's separating the kids from the mommies, and there are kids in prisons. And Grandma, this is just not fair." And I said, "Right, Anya." And she says, "Grandma, can you fix that?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying." And then I listed all the people that she knows who are trying. And then I said, "Well, Anya, what are you doing for justice?" And she paused. "Well, Grandma, I try to be kind to everyone." Out of the mouth of a 6-year-old, what they see on TV and what they're processing, and how they must wonder about what is happening. Is this normal? Do kids have to worry about being taken from their parents? It breaks your heart.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful modeling, Pat, that you and the 6-year-old is already having like this conversation, which shows she's thinking about it, you know?
And that she
So,
was comfortable to ask.
right. And so it's definitely just engaging, I think, that part of engaging and sharing, just thinking about, oh, what did you see or experience in your growing years, especially for the young adults who are considering taking action or want to take action and can think back to maybe, civil rights, looking at that as a time in our most recent history. And I often tell people, that era happened and we focus and put a lot of attention on Black Americans who were putting their bodies on the line to make change. And I think that that's good and we should do that. But also, you have to think about it. So a whole lot of people who weren't doing anything. And those people we are connected to and we know now. And they were alive then too. And so you have to ask the question, well, what were you doing when the time for tremendous change was happening in our country? Where were you at? Why didn't you take action? What was happening? And I think there's lessons that we learned there too. I was watching the interview, and you may be seeing this too, between President Obama and David Letterman on his Netflix show, and they were talking about the recent thing, the recent anniversary of the walk across the Pettus Bridge, and David Letterman was just remarking on how impressed he was with John Lewis and saying he was about John Lewis's age. And he was commenting that he had no idea what was going on in the country at that time. As a matter of fact, he said he was on a road trip with his friends across the country. And in my opinion, he lamented when he said, "Why was I not there? What was I doing? Why didn't I know?" And I think that's the thing with a lot of things that happen in the world that we created here in the United States, where we see the Black and brown families living under this tremendous pain and pressure of racism every day, that we can't not see it. We can't just ignore it. Whereas you get a white person like David Letterman, who can see the tremendous thing happening during the civil rights. He had no clue about it. And matter of fact, he was on a road trip with his friends. And I often think about, how is that being played out, or will that be played out for us 20, 30 years from now, when the generation after us come up, and you can say, well, who was engaged during this time of change and who wasn't? How are we talking about what's happening in our country right now? So I'm inviting you to really think about how you can speak up and speak out and weave a better narrative in your family that will hopefully help us from generation to come. Because I believe we continuously end up in these places of racial unrest in our country because we're not engaging and really having these deep conversations like the one Pat and Anya was having, and really getting into talking to our children or our grandchildren about our own fears, our own apprehensions, how we've taken what's been happening in this world and how we've decided what to do with it. And if we did nothing, that's fine. Then we can change and move forward now, you know. So yeah, I really feel passionate about encouraging us to talk. So my final little soapbox with this is a long one. I don't think I'm going to go through all of that.
Go for it. Good time. Go for
But
it.
I'm just inviting us, you know, take yourself off mute. You know, we all must share in all the good and the bad. You know, it seems that we have a generational gap right now in how we understand the dangers of racial oppression. It seems that, you know, like as I said before, you know, we were in this mess before a couple generations before us, and here we are again, and it seems like the white supremacist groups are just popping up, and there's so many things going on in our country right now. So just as passing family traditions down from generation to generation, so it goes with racism. Not talking about the ways in which you struggled with racism, how you witnessed the racial turmoil of the past, as well as the times of taking a bold stance against such oppression. It is perpetuating a void of understanding about history of race relations in this country. And to change this, to change a generation, we must talk together and listen together, because the fight against racism is going to take all of us. So you can, if you would like to put some questions in the chat box or come off the microphone and share some things, comments, questions, thoughts. And as you're sharing, I'll just have up the upcoming opportunities to engage with race and faith. And I can get to those announcements after I hear whatever questions or comments you may have.
This is Susan, and I have a comment, which was something, the racism can be invisible to those of us who aren't directly affected. And it really made an impression on me reading a Facebook account of a African American man who kept getting picked up by police in Cambridge. And so he resorted to putting a car seat in his car and toys, and how that worked. But it really hit me because, you know, it's so easy for us not to see it because we're not the ones being picked up. And so hearing those stories was very effective to me.
Yeah, yeah. And so it'll be interesting, you know, for him. I'm sure he's going to share that with his children and trying to tell them ways to stay safe, right? And I think it's what I've learned from doing this and talking about this from white families time again. Like you said, sometimes we don't always see it. What I hear from a lot of people is, well, we didn't have any people of color in our neighborhood. We didn't have any people of color in our area. Or our town was pretty white, or our church was pretty white. And so I'm always telling people, well, investigate those things now. So if you grew up, what does that tell you? You can go back to that. What is that telling you about white supremacy? So whether you have had direct engagement or whether you think you've had direct engagement or not, we're always getting messages. And so it's now just to go back through and think that, well, if I was in an all-white town or all-white school, well, what does that tell me about the rest of the world? What does that tell me about people of color? Were there no people of color, or did I just not have to see them? You know, so that's another way I would encourage you to think about the story that you tell, or how you tell the story.
And you're right, I live in Wauwatosa, and I am aware that there was covenants, right? That, you know, kept African Americans out of certain neighborhoods in Wauwatosa. Yes.
And even the mission statement of the police in Wauwatosa, that's a terrible mission statement. And you can compare that to some other suburbs that have tried to use community policing in a positive community experience. But Wauwatosa needs to change. It's very dated and very limited.
I grew up in Wauwatosa and definitely was, and I'm 73, so I'm kind of old. But anyway, in the years
No,
that I,
wait a minute. Let me just 73. You're
yeah.
not too old for this conversation. This is about generational wisdom, generational experiences. This is saying your voice matters. So don't dare poo-poo your age in this conversation. It's important.
Oh, well, and I did see, I mean, when I grew up in Wauwatosa, it was very, very white. And I remember having a very nice black family move in. He was a dentist, and his son went to my junior high, but he was older than I was, a couple years older. And they didn't stay real long, which I can understand because, I mean, I just, as a young person, I could, in my, I guess, developmental stage, could understand why that wasn't working out for the black family and for this young black man or this boy that was, in our junior high. And now it's, it's still having many of its problems, but it's more integrated, I think, as far as housing goes. Let's go there. Now I live in Whitefish Bay, but I must say that we have this group called Bay Bridge, and its mission is to create equity or to support equity within the community. And now they're having a talk tomorrow where they are bringing in different people from different groups within the city. And I missed the last talk. They had students. This was virtual, but they had students from the school come in, and they go to all the board meetings, just to all the school board meetings, I guess also the city board meetings, just to see that there aren't any racist policies,
Mhm.
or they will challenge them if there are any. And I just found out about this group. It was just on, I think, the library's website. But and since then, both my sister and I now have joined the book group, and so it's helping me now to go from my heart and my
Yeah.
soul to action.
That's good. And I would say take one of your grandchildren with you. This is how we bridge
Oh,
it.
but they live in Colorado.
Well, send them information. Now you can say it. You can say, hey, I went to this cool thing. Check this out. Start engaging them. So thinking about all the ways you are being active, or if you come across a book or something, how do you take that and engage the next generation with that same information? Where now you can learn together.
Yeah, and what we did do.
That's the thing. That's what I'm really trying to, in which I'm really hoping families grab a hold of, is taking that information and making it a family approach.
Yeah.
And I know it's almost 1 o'clock, so I just want to say real quick, we have an event coming up over the King holiday. It's called Something to Say, and it's about this same topic, empowering families to have conversations about racism together. So we're creating learning modules, and it'll be a slew of videos of different families engaging together about racism. So please, you can check that out. It's on my website, and you can find us on Facebook. Race and Faith, we offer talks. If you ever want to have us in your other organizations give a talk or education series, I'm working on putting some courses together online that folks can just take at their convenience. For right now, people usually hire me out to lead a series of conversations. I've been working with Erica from Bridge the Divide, which is a group out in Cedarburg that's been doing a lot to address, kind of like the Bay Bridge group that you were mentioning of. That's the Cedarburg version. And we've been doing a series looking at whiteness, navigating whiteness, and how that looks in the workplace. And so we're working with and open to it's particularly white women who want to be better leaders, and we're coaching them in a group. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you can feel free to reach out to me. You can find us on Facebook. We have a book club, the Race and Faith Book Club, which is on Facebook as well. And this is just my basic information. If you want to email me, you can do that again. And as Pat mentioned before, you can make donations on our website. We have a donation page, and I'm always taking those. So,
Well, let's wrap it up. My goodness, Rhonda, all those comments and testimonies about you having the ability to motivate, to inspire, to give us hope, that you're spot on, that you are a champion for diversity, and that you are the kind of force we need in Milwaukee, but we need to match you with courage for courage.
mhm.
And I thank everyone who joined the conversation. And stay tuned. We have this that's going to continue. Barbara Tolles is our guest next month. And the link that worked, woo! The link that worked, save that on your calendar. We are always the third Tuesday of the month at noon.
Is this
Final
about?
comments, appreciations? You could just jump in and tell her thanks.
Thank you. It was very interesting.
Thanks,
Oh,
Rhonda. Good to see you.
hey, Tom. Hey, Katie. Thank you. Hey,
Great.
Barbara.
Hi, there you are.
Good to see
It's
you.
great, Rhonda. That was really helpful. That was.
Oh, I hope it was. I felt like I was going by so fast. The time runs, it just leaves.
So much more.
Yeah.
Hey, Rhonda. I
Hey,
love I love to be Facebook friends. I'm really interested in all that you have to offer. You said you have a book club?
yeah, Race and Faith Book Club. It's on we do it on Facebook too. We're on a break right now. We'll probably start our next book next month.
Okay, because we trying to get everybody to be on like to support all the book clubs. You know, like there's a lot of books out there. So trying to
Yeah.
put them on one thing. So if I can connect to your Facebook page, that'd be great. So I can keep sharing. I'm kind of a
Oh,
post.
please do. Are we friends on Facebook?
No, but we will be if you allow me to.
Rhonda to Rhonda.
Usually I like to see people's faces, because I'll be like, you will see my face and be like, hey, I know you. I'm like, I don't know you.
That's
Like,
okay.
oh, I saw you on the Zoom. Oh, okay, but I didn't see you.
Thank you so much. This was so helpful.
Oh, good. I'm glad it was. Thank you.
I got COVID hair, so you know. I can't
You
see
got COVID hair?
well, the hair.
At least it's only the hair.
Right. Okay.
So friends, you can invite your friends to this series. Share the link, share the knowledge, inspire action. Rhonda Hill, you know I love you, girlfriend.
I love you too, Pat. You're a great supporter. Do we just oh, okay.
So I'll end the recording. Stay
Okay.
strong, my friends, and be brave.
Okay.
Oh, good.